thought I might do a quick video here on my BA XR6 Falcon that I recently converted to turbo. There's quite a few of these conversions starting to get about the place, and I found that some of the information out there is a bit misleading or hard to come by. So I thought I might make a video that sort of clears some of that up to make it easier for anyone else that wants to do this conversion. The particular car here is a 2003 model, 4-speed automatic, which you'll find the majority of BA XR6s getting around the place are. I bought this car nearly 5 years ago now when I was on my P's. It's the first car I bought, and when I got it, it was in really rough condition. The body was a mess with dents and scrapes on it everywhere. The bumper was half on it. The interior had chook feathers and hay in it. Engine bay was pretty messy, and it was making some pretty weird noises through the driveline. Anyway, for whatever reason, 18-year-old me decided that I wanted this car. So I spent my hard-earned blockbuster dollars at the time and bought it. I spent the next year spending every sort of paycheck I could get, fixing it up, making it into a car that I was happy with, and then I just dailied it. About a year ago, I decided that I wanted an XR6 Turbo. I was getting kind of bored of this car, but at the same time, with how much time and money I was put into it, I didn't really want to get rid of it. I'd seen a few videos on the internet of other people putting motors in them, and I thought I can probably do that, so that's what I decided I'd do. It has become pretty apparent to me that in Tasmania, getting a hold of Barra turbo motors or anything performance Falcon wise is sort of difficult to do. There just isn't as many of those cars available down here, and when they do come up, they sell very quickly and people want big money for them. So I ended up turning to the mainland to source an engine, and I found this one on eBay. It was listed for $1,000 and it looked pretty rough in the photos, but it had all the bolt-ons on it, came with the intercooler and piping and the ECU, which I figured would save me having to hunt around for little parts. So I got it sent to me, and sure as hell when I got it, it was in pretty rough condition. The cooling system was full of rust, had oil leaks all over it, and it was just a messy, old looking motor. But I figured I'd just tear it down, throw some new gaskets in it, put it back together with a set of valve springs and put it in the car. However, when I got halfway through doing that, I discovered that the motor actually had some bad valves in it that weren't sealing and was pretty well a write-off. It was at that point I decided I could either turbo the engine that was in the car with the parts that I got on this motor, or give the whole motor a rebuild and just throw it in the car. I decided to go that way, even though it's not that cost effective, just purely because I thought it would be cool to build a motor. I'd never done it before. So that's what I ended up doing. I did plan to sort of film the entire progress start to finish, but it just ended up not really working out like that once I got halfway through it and realised what was wrong with the motor. So I filmed bits and bobs of it, which I plan to put in a separate video for anyone that wants to watch it. There is some interesting information in there and some good shots that you might want to see, but it's not really an in-depth how to build a Barra motor video. Anyway, when it comes to putting these engines in these cars, it's pretty straightforward. They're obviously a Barra either way, so they're going to bolt in the car pretty easily, and it's realistically just the stuff that supports the engine that you need to change. ECUs are different between turbo and non-turbo Falcons. You can flash tune an NA ECU to run a turbo, but they don't support electronic boost control. So I was pretty keen to get my hands on a turbo ECU because I wanted that feature. Gearboxes and drive lines, so that means your diff, are different between the two. They visually look very similar, but the turbo and V8 models do run a bigger diff and a slightly stronger automatic. This particular car still retains its NA driveline in it. I was fortunate that this one has been fitted with an LSD, which most didn't come with, and it appears to be working pretty well at this point in time. Other things you'll need to consider is your fuel system. The original fuel pump in the car is probably not up to the task of running a turbo, especially if you want to modify it. That's an easy thing to swap out. I chose to with this car just to upgrade it straight to a Walbro 255 right out of the box, and now I don't have to worry about it for the power levels I want to make. The exhaust systems are obviously different between the turbo and NA cars. From the catalytic converter, well, basically straight off the dump pipe of the turbo back, it has to be changed. With this car, I managed to get my hands on a new old stock, genuine Ford catalytic converter from a BF for really cheap. That's usually one of the first things that people upgrade on these cars, but for the purpose of getting it running, did the job for me. The rest of the exhaust system I got actually came off an XR8. It appears that they bolt straight up once you go from the catalytic converter back. So that's what I fitted there. You can pick up those systems for next to nothing because everyone rips them off their stock XR6s. So that's a cheap thing to get. Another little snag I ran into while doing this conversion was actually with the Turbo ECU. So I was able to get it programmed to the car and fired it up using a readily available program known as ForScan and an ELM327, I believe it's called, Bluetooth scanner for the OBD port, which you can pick up off eBay for cheap. However, when I got it started up, it was flashing P on the instrument cluster and the transmission was making some pretty horrid noises. When I went to drive the car, it was stuck in third gear, which was indicating limpo mode, and I had no speedometer. It turns out that because of the fact that most turbos, or all turbos as far as I'm aware for that fact, have traction control as standard, and with the NAs it's an option only, there's where my issue was coming from. So the traction control is part of the ABS system, and these cars get their speed input from the ABS system. So because I had an ECU that was configured to look for its speed input from an ABS system with traction control, it wasn't finding it because this car doesn't have traction control, and then it was throwing an error to the car. It couldn't tell what speed it was doing, so bam, straight to limpo mode. That's not an option realistically that you can change with just a basic generic scan tool, and you're probably going to have to take the car to a tuner or someone that's capable of flashing the ECU to fix it for you. I didn't really have anyone sort of local to me that was comfortable with doing that sort of thing. I did ring a couple of the tuning shops around here and asked them if they had dealt with it before, and they were like, oh, we only tune the cars, we probably could fix it for you mate, but we don't really know. So the next option I came up with was I'd ring Ford and see if they could do it for me. Now Ford was really difficult to deal with. I rang them up, told them what I'd done with the car, told them what it was doing and what I was pretty certain the problem was, and asked if I could talk to one of their technicians just to sort of, you know, clarify with them if they could fix it and tell them what I'd done to the car to make it easier. Unfortunately, Ford didn't want to let me talk to their technicians. They'd only let me talk to their front desk staff, and they were really vague on the phone if they could fix it. They wouldn't tell me if they could, and they just said, drop the car in, we'll tell you if it's sorted. So that was my only option really. Put the car in a tow truck and sent it to Ford, and 2 days later I picked it up from them, $380 bill, car's fixed. They never told me what they did, but I know what they did. So if you're using a turbo PCM or ECU as you call it, I advise before you put it in the car, go and contact, you know, a tuner, someone that's doing standalone looms or whatever, someone that's got the ability to flash these ECUs. Bill Hooton, who I know, comes to mind. He is capable of doing it and has told me if I wanted to do it in the future, it's an easy thing for him to fix. So get that out of the way straight up, and then you're not going to have that problem to deal with. Now I should note it's not really me having an attack at Ford as such for not wanting to discuss details with me. I can imagine why they don't really want to share that sort of information, but it was just a frustration that I had during the process. Another thing to watch out for if you're using a turbo ECU is that third plug that I mentioned earlier needs something to plug into it. Now, as far as I'm aware, on all of the XR6s, you already have existing wiring loom in the front of the car that has the positions for your electronic boost control in the turbo and a boost sensor that goes down near the battery. However, there is no cable to plug into the ECU. There's a small little patch harness about this long that you can get out of the turbos that will plug straight to the ECU, and it routes down past your airbox here, and there's a plug in here that it will plug into. I do have a little bit of footage that I shot earlier that I will show where that goes. Another thing that you got to watch out for is actually your power steering cooler. The NA power steering cooler is just a little bar that wraps around down the mouth of the bumper, and that's where your intercooler needs to go, so it gets in the way. Turbos run from factory a different style cooler where it's a similar bar, but it bolts sort of like on the bottom of the radiator support bar, and then there's an additional cooler that sits up just behind your Ford emblem here that loops in with it, so it gives it a bit of extra cooling. You also have to move the horn. That is also in the way of the intercooler. I'm not sure exactly where that sits on the XR6s. I just moved it to somewhere I can find where it fits. I'll cut now to some footage when I had the bumper off the car, which shows what I really did with all of that. When it comes to fitting the intercooler, it's all pretty well straightforward, providing you're using just stock parts. You will need to drill some holes for the intercooler to mount, as they're not there on the non-turbo cars. However, the brackets on the intercooler itself really sort of force the cooler to sit in position, so if you just mark the holes where it naturally wants to sit and drill them, you should be fine. The next thing you're going to run into when putting one of these engines in a NA car is that the original power steering cooler is sort of a metal loop that sits down the bottom of the radiator there. On the turbos, they run two coolers for the power steering. One bolts directly on the bottom of the radiator, and the other one sits up just underneath the hood latch here. In my case, when I bought the engine, for some reason he only sent me the bottom cooler. I went around to several wreckers trying to find the upper cooler, and they were all damaged because the cars had front end damage. Just before I finally installed the engine, I did find a guy that was going to post me one, and for whatever reason he posted me the bottom one again, so it was useless to me. What I ended up having to do is sacrifice the cooler that I was going to use for my transmission, and I ended up sandwiching it between the intercooler here and the AC cooler. It's not really an ideal spot where I have it there, because you really want the best airflow as possible through the intercooler. However, as you can see, space is pretty limited as it is, so I don't really have much room to pick and choose where I'm going to throw coolers, and I did want to leave some space to put an external transmission cooler at a later date. The pipe work for the power steering cooler, I believe, was just some 5/8 rubber tubing. You can see it tucks up underneath the intercooler pipe there, and then it runs along underneath the turbo here, and there's a little block underneath there where the old steel lines for the old cooler used to mount up. I've just spliced in there with some joiners, and that sorts out the power steering cooler. Despite its location, it actually runs the power steering a lot cooler now. This car used to have problems with steering shutter when it would get hot. That's all but eliminated now, so that's been a bonus. The next thing that you're going to have to deal with if you're doing this conversion is you're going to have to move the horn. The horn is mounted just underneath the hood latch here with this metal bracket on the NA cars. Gets in the way of the intercooler, so you're going to need to move it. All I have done is I've just chosen to splice off the wire where it used to connect, and I've ran it in some tubing here underneath the driver's side headlight, and then behind this metal plate here you'll see the two horns mounted up there, which works just fine. Other than that, that's pretty well all you're going to have to do at the front of the car, and then you can put your bumper back on. Here we have the elusive third boost control cable that I see a lot of people talk about on the internet. If you're doing this conversion on a XR6, most likely you have present the wiring loom for your boost control and boost sensor. If that's the case, there is a third wire on the Turbo Ecu which connects up just under here. You'll need a small little patch loom out of a wreck, which basically just runs along underneath your airbox here and up underneath the passenger side headlight. There'll be a plug present right there that it connects into. That wiring loom then runs along the front of the car and joins up to this plug here for your boost pressure sensor, and also has a plug down here for your wastegate solenoid. If you were doing this conversion on a non-XR6 like an XT or something like that, I don't believe the wiring is present. I haven't checked it before, but if it isn't present, you're going to need to come up with some way to do that. I have seen a fellow on Facebook that is doing standalone looms now that basically plug up underneath the ECU there, run around the front of the car, and it gives you those two plugs, so you're not going to need to change any wiring in the car that way. But if you're doing this on a XR6 like this to begin with,
all you're going to need is that little patch loom there, and the rest of the wiring is there for you.
Other than your exhaust, ECU, fueling, intercooler, power steering and the horn that I just showed, there's not a whole lot more that you really need to change when it comes to bolting these engines in these cars if you're just going a turbo motor straight in. I might mention that with your power steering, with the steering shaft that joins to the rack, there is some sort of form of heat shielding on the XR6 turbos and presumably the V8s. I don't know how important that really is. A lot of cars I've seen with it, it's all starting to crumble and fall away as it is. I did get a hold of some for this car, so I did fit it. Something else I might talk about is people who are going to be turboing their naturally aspirated motors, which is probably the majority of people who are going to do this conversion. Most of everything that I've had to do with this you're going to have to do, but there is a couple of extras that you have to deal with, one of those being your map sensor. XR6 turbos run a different map sensor that has a different plug. The rest of the wiring harness on the engine is identical, and for that matter this engine actually has the original NA harness on it because the harness that came with the engine was damaged. The way to dealing with that when you fit the turbo map sensor is you need to swap the plug ends over, or you can buy a pre-made patch loom that converts from the NA style plug to the map sensor for the turbos. If you're going to swap the plugs over, the wiring diagrams are quite easy to find on Google, and it's only 4 wires you need to change around. Another thing with your non-turbo engines is your fuel pressure regulator. I believe that non-turbos run a 2.5 bar or 2 bars, it's something like that, fuel pressure regulator, and the turbos run a 3.5 bar. They swapped out, the fuel rails are identical between the two, but you need to change it over. Another thing is your water lines for your turbo. These run stock a Garrett turbo that's water cooled, and the water supply for it comes off your heater return pipes that exit your thermostat and out of the back of the water pump and wrap around the engine. On the non-turbo cars there's no provision there to hook up the pipes to your turbo, and that only exists on the pipes that come on turbo cars. So for that you'll either have to source yourself a set of suitable pipes that have got the bits on it already, or you'll have to modify the thermostat housing and water pump or however you come up with it to get a water supply to your turbo. Another thing you'll need to do to a non-turbo motor if you're bolting all this up to it is to drill and tap your sump for an oil drain for your turbo. There's another YouTuber by the name of Scott who's done a couple of conversions now on NA cars utilising their original engines, and in his videos he covers that. He would be a good resource to have a look at if you're doing it that way. Other than that, NA or turbo motor, it's all pretty well the same process from there. I might mention a couple of differences between the earlier turbo motors and NA motors, because there seems to be a lot of confusion out there. So as far as I'm aware, after pulling them apart, when it comes to your early B series, like BA motors, your NA motors have the same rods as the turbos, but they do have different exhaust valves. Turbos have an O stamped on their valve, and I presume they're made out of a different material. They have lower compression pistons in the turbo motors, and they also have floating wrist pins. Other than that, the engines are pretty well identical. In your later model Falcons, obviously once you start talking different LPG motors and turbo motors, you get different rods, various differences, but for your BAs, that's pretty well the main differences between the two engines. From here, what I plan to do with the car next, obviously I plan to get a tune put on it. No one really keeps a stock XR6 turbo. Before I can do that, I need to source a set of high flowing fuel injectors for it. The engine has already been fitted with a set of Crow valve springs when I built it, so I don't have to worry about that. However, the whole bottom of the engine is actually stock. In hindsight, I really should have forged the motor when I built it, but due to the weaker driveline in the car, I never really intend to make massive power with this engine that's past the limits of a standard B series motor, and I was trying to keep costs down. Exhaust wise, I do plan to do something with it. It's only got the stock system on it at the moment. I'm not sure if I'm going to remove the whole system, catalytic convert it a lot and upgrade it, or if I'm just going to do a centre muffler delete for the time being to give it a different note and just see what it will do with what it's got. I'm leaning to going that way, but we'll see what happens. I also want to fit a catch can to the car before I get it tuned, and I need to have a look at the transmission. The transmission in this car has always been a bit flaky since I bought it. It makes some pretty weird noises when it's cold, and it shifts erratically sometimes. And since putting the turbo in it, it's really starting to struggle. It's flaring a lot on third gear and having some troubles. I have got another gearbox to go in the car. I don't know much about the condition of it, but the seller I bought it from swears that it's good, so we'll see how that goes. I did give it a coat of paint the other day, so it's basically a reconditioned transmission now, so it should be fine. Aside from one very sad transmission and the initial hiccups that I had with getting the speedo working properly to take the car to limp home mode, the whole conversion's been really straightforward. It's fortunate that these cars are fitted already with these motors, so everything bolts straight in. Everything's already there to fit properly. So providing you can source all the parts that you need to do the job, it shouldn't be really too much of a difficult task. If you are interested in seeing what went on with inside the engine when I pull it apart, I will put a link in the description for the videos for that. There is some information in there regarding on fitting valve springs in these cars that you might want to see, or just a general look inside of a Barra engine. I hope that that clears up any little sort of small things that you might come across while doing this conversion. Those are really the small little problems that you're going to come across. The rest of it's all pretty self-explanatory, and if you're someone that's pulled a few engines out before, you should have no dramas doing it at all. So I guess all there is left to do now is start it up and take it for a drive.